Now for exploring the Redux basics, I have a brand new project, and this isn't even a React project. It's an empty folder in the end, just have some settings for my IDE here. Now you can therefore also just create a brand new empty folder. We don't need a React app yet. Of course, we will add one later, but for the moment, an empty folder will do. And in that folder, you can create a new JavaScript file. You can give it any name you want. I will name it redux-demo.js. Now we will execute this file with Node.js because Node.js allows us to run JavaScript outside of the browser. And of course, we already have Node.js installed because we needed that for creating our React apps, for installing other third-party packages with NPM, and also for running our development server. So we already do have Node.js installed. And now here, in this empty folder, I will run npm init, and you should do this too. Open a terminal or a command prompt, navigate into this empty folder, and run npm init. To be precise, run npm init-y, which simply answers all these default questions with yes. If you don't run it with -y, just answer them manually with yes. Now this gives us a package.json file, which is not too interesting for us, but we need it to install third-party packages. Because now we want to install Redux. For this, we can now run npm install Redux. That's the name of that package, and when we run this, this package gets installed into this otherwise empty project folder. We therefore get a Node modules folder, which now contains Redux and all the dependencies of Redux. Now we're ready to use Redux here. So in the Redux demo.js file, we can now use it. Now for that, we need to import Redux. And since we're going to execute this file with Node.js, the import will look a little bit different than what we're used to. We import Redux like this. This might look strange, but that is the default Node.js import syntax for importing a third-party package. And we import Redux from the Redux package with this syntax. Now we need to do a couple of things. If you recall that slide, we will need to create that store. We will need to create a reducer function, which changes that store. We will then also need an action and a component, or since we're not using a React app yet, any other code that sets up a subscription to the store. So I think it makes sense to start with the store, since that is the central piece and concept of Redux. Now we can create such a store by using that imported Redux object, and then on that object we can call createStore. That's a method exposed by the Redux library, which does what the name implies. It creates a store. Now let's store that store in a constant, which you of course don't have to name store, but I think it's a name that makes sense given that we create a store here. And then the question is, how do we proceed? What do we do with that store? Well, that store should manage some data. And the data which it manages is in the end determined by the reducer function, because it's the reducer function which will produce new state snapshots. The reducer has the goal of spitting out a new state snapshot whenever an action reaches it. And when we run this code for the first time, the reducer will also be executed with a default action, so to say, that should spit out the initial state. So therefore, the next thing we need to add is a reducer function. And I will name this counter reducer, but the name is up to you. And that stores a function. Here I'm using this anonymous arrow function syntax. Of course, you could also create that function like this. That would also be fine. But I'll stick to the other syntax. And that's now our reducer function. It's not finished though. A reducer function is a standard JavaScript function, but it will be called by the Redux library And it will then always receive two pieces of input, two parameters: the old or existing state and the action that was dispatched. And then this reducer function must return a certain output. It must always return a new state object. And therefore, a reducer function should be a pure function, which basically means that the same inputs, the same values for the inputs, always should produce exactly the same output, and there should be no side effects inside of that function. So you must not send a HTTP request or write something to local storage or fetch something from local storage there. Instead, a reducer should really just be a function that takes the given inputs, which are provided by Redux, and then produces the expected output, a new state object. So therefore, back in code here, this reducer function will receive the state, the current state, and the action. It receives that by default because the reducer will ultimately be executed by the Redux library. And then we should return the new state, which will replace the existing state. Now here on the slide, I said that the output is a state object. It typically will be, because in most applications, state is more than just one single value, but theoretically it can be any kind of value type. State can also just be a number or a string, but in reality, it will most often be an object. So here we then want to return, let's say, a new object, and then this object can have any structure we want. This is totally up to us, the developer of this page. So here we could have a counter field in this object, which is 0, for example. Now this reducer would always return an object with a counter set to 0. Now that might not be too realistic though. Instead, the counter should probably be the existing counter, and then let's say the existing counter plus 1. So state.counter plus 1, referring to the existing state, which we get automatically, accessing the old counter value, which was stored in the state, and adding 1 to it for the new counter value of the newly returned state. That's now how a basic reducer could look like. Now it's this counter reducer which we pass to the createStore function, because the store needs to know which reducer is responsible for changing that store. Because keep in mind, it's the reducer that works together with the store. So the store wants to know who the reducer function is that will manipulate the data. So we now got a reducer function and we got our store. Now we also need someone who subscribes to that store, and then we need an action that can be dispatched. Now let's start with the subscription. For this, I'll add a new constant here, and I'll name it counter subscriber, and this will hold a function. And again, you could of course also write this with the function keyword if you preferred that. So the subscriber is a function here, which does not get any parameters, but where we then, inside of the function, can reach out to the store and call getState. GetState is a method which is available on the store created with createStore. And it will give us the latest state snapshot after it was updated. So this subscription function will soon be triggered whenever the state changes. And then when it is triggered, we can get that latest state after it was changed with the getState method here. So then we have that latest state here, and we can just console log that state here. Now we just need to make Redux aware of this subscriber function and tell it that this function should be executed whenever our state changes. And we do that by reaching out to the store and calling the subscribe method on the store, another method which exists there. The subscribe method then wants such a subscriber function. So the subscribe method expects a function which Redux will then execute for us whenever the data in the store changed. So here we now pass the counter subscriber to subscribe. Important, we don't execute counter subscriber here, we just point at it. Just as we did not execute counter reducer here, but just point at it. Because both the reducer as well as the subscriber function will be executed by Redux. Now we got a subscriber and we got our reducer. What we don't have is an action. Nonetheless, let's save that file and then open up the terminal or command prompt. Here I'm using the integrated one. And then you can run node and then your file name, in my case, redux-demo.js. And this will execute this file and the code inside of the file with Node.js. And if you do that, you should see an error. You get an error that you cannot read property counter of undefined. Now, this is an expected error. And why are we getting it? Well, we are creating a store here, and that store has a reducer as it needs to. And in that reducer, we return a state object, which sets the counter to the old state counter +1. The problem is that when that store is initialized, Redux will execute this reducer for the first time. So this code will then run when the store is created. The problem is that at this point of time, state is undefined. We have no existing state because it's the first time this is executing. That's why we should give state, this state parameter, a default value, which is assumed if it would otherwise be undefined, so that for the first time this runs, it does have a value. If it then runs thereafter, and we do have an existing state, the default value will not be used. But here, for the first time, we want to have a fallback default value which will be used. And here I'll set my default value to an object which has a counter property which is 0 initially. With that change made, if we save that and we now try this again, we again run node redux-demo.js, now this works. But we don't see anything in the terminal. We don't see any output. The reason for this is that we do have a subscription here, but we haven't dispatched any actions yet. Yes, there is this initialization action kind of dispatched by Redux, but that does not trigger our subscription here. We could, of course, still get our initial state by just console logging store.getState here if we needed that initial state as well. If I log this here after the store is created, then we see the initial state being output here. It's an object with a counter value of 1, y1, because the default is 0, and when this runs for the first time, we increment it by 1. That's why this is our new state thereafter, after the initialization. We could do that, but I don't even want to do that here. Instead, let's now create and dispatch an action. For this, we again use that store object, and on that object, besides getState and subscribe, we can call dispatch. And dispatch is a method which dispatches an action. Now, an action is a JavaScript object. It's a JavaScript object with a type property, which acts as an identifier. Typically, you use a string here, and then this should be a unique string, so that every action, every distinct action which you dispatch leads to different things being done in the reducer. Currently, we have no code to do different things, but we're going to add that soon. So we dispatch such an object, and here we could give this a type of increment for incrementing the counter. In its simplest form, that is all we need. Now with this, if we save that without doing anything else, if I execute the redux-demo.js file again, we get this output, counter 2. We get this output because it is 1 after the initialization, as we saw a couple of seconds ago. And now we dispatched a new action which caused this reducer function to run again, and therefore the counter was again incremented by 1, which is why we now see counter 2 here. That is in a nutshell how Redux works. But of course, that's not all it's able to do, because currently the type of action we're dispatching here has no effect at all. So let's take a closer look at that as well.